My brother died on a Thursday morning in October of 2019, and I was not there, and he did not know I wanted to be, and the last thing I ever said to him was said in anger 31 years before his death, and I have been living inside that fact ever since. My name is Edward. I'm 85 years old, and the question I am carrying, the question that has no answer and will never have one, is whether my brother forgave me before he died. And what I want to tell you today is not the answer to that question, because I don't have it, but what it is meant to live without it, and what I understand now about the silence that made the question necessary in the first place. I need to start at the beginning, because these things never begin where they appear to begin, and because the beginning is the only place that makes honest sense of everything that came after it. My brother's name was Charles. He was born 14 months after me, in 1939, which means we grew up so close in age that the boundary between us was, for most of our childhood, almost invisible. The way boundaries between things that are nearly the same are always the hardest to see. We shared a bedroom for 15 years in a house in rural Pennsylvania that our father had built himself on land his father had farmed. And the sharing of that room produced between us the specific intimacy of two people who have no privacy from each other, who know each other's sleeping sounds and morning moods, and private fears, and particular ways of being alone, who have been so continuously present to each other that the other's presence becomes part of the background of the world, part of the texture of what normal feels like, so thoroughly there that you stop noticing it until the day it is gone. We were different from each other in the ways that brothers close in age are often different, as if the nearness of their birth produced, by some compensatory mechanism, a complementarity of character rather than a duplication. I was the serious one, the planner, the boy who thought before he spoke, and who carried a slight tension about the future that expressed itself in conscientiousness and in the particular quality of attention I gave to things I cared about, which was the full and somewhat intense quality of someone for whom caring is not casual. Charles was lighter than I was, not in the sense of being less deep, but in the sense of being less burdened by the weight of his own caring, able to be in the present moment with a completeness that I observed with admiration, and, if I am honest, occasional envy, the envy of a more anxious person watching a less anxious one move through the same world with considerably more ease. Our father was a quiet man who expressed his love through his presence and his labor, who built things and fixed things and showed up to the important events with a steadiness that I understood only much later in life, as a form of devotion that did not require the verbal expression that I had sometimes wished for as a boy. Our mother was warmer in her expression, generous with her physical affection and her words, and she died when I was 17 and Charles was 16, which is the first event in the story I am telling that shaped what came after in ways that I am still, at 85, in the process of fully understanding. Our mother's death did something to the two of us that I could not have articulated at 17, and that I understand now as the forging of a bond that went beyond the ordinary bond of brothers, a bond that included the shared experience of a loss that changed the shape of the household and the family, and the future in ways that neither of us had prepared for, and that neither of us had anyone adequate to help us process. Our father, in his grief, became quieter than he had been, more interior, more organized around the work of continuing rather than the work of acknowledging what had happened. And Charles and I became, in the absence of our mother's warmth, more dependent on each other in that warmth's place than we might otherwise have been. Not dependent in a way that was spoken or even recognized, but simply in the way that two people who have lost the primary source of something they need begin to turn toward each other for it without deciding to. We went through the years after her death, as young men go through such things, forward and with whatever was available to go forward with, which in our case was each other, and the work of becoming adults in the specific and unglamorous way that becoming an adult requires, the getting of education and employment, and the building of lives that were, in their external shapes, reasonably successful. I became an accountant, which suited my particular relationship with precision and order. Charles became a contractor, which suited his particular relationship with making things. With the satisfaction of building something you could stand back from and see completely. And he was good at it in the way that people are good at things that are an expression of who they actually are rather than a performance of who they think they should be. We lived in different cities for most of our adult lives, which was the natural result of the directions our lives took, and which created a distance that was geographical rather than emotional. A distance that we bridged with the regular phone calls and the annual gatherings of the kind that families who are genuinely close maintain. A cross separation, because the closeness requires maintenance, and the maintenance is understood as important. Charles married a woman named Ruth in 1965, and they had 3 children across the following decade. And I married a woman named Gloria in 1968, and we had 2 children. And the families overlapped at holidays, and at the occasional summer visit, and through the children, who knew each other as cousins with the comfortable familiarity of children who see each other regularly enough to have their own relationship independent of their parents. Charles and I talked on the phone at least once a week for most of 20 years. I want to say that clearly because the story I am about to tell involves a silence that lasted 31 years. And I want you to understand what the silence was a departure from, how much it cost relative to what had preceded it, and how complete a rupture it represented in something that had been the consistent background of both our lives since childhood. Once a week for 20 years. In the era before cell phones and email, when a phone call required a deliberate act and a specific time set aside for it, when the regularity of those calls was a statement about what the relationship was worth and what you were willing to do to maintain it. 20 years of that regularity, and then silence. The argument happened in the summer of 1988. I am going to describe it because the description matters, but I am also going to try to describe it without the inflation that memory and guilt can apply to events over time, without making it larger or more dramatic than it actually was, because I think the smallness of it, relative to what it cost, is itself the most important thing about it. Our father had died in 1985, leaving behind the house he had built and the land it sat on and a modest estate that represented the accumulated labor of his entire working life. Charles and I were the sole heirs. We had agreed, in the months after our father's death, that we would hold the property for a period before deciding what to do with it, partly out of grief, partly out of the practical understanding that decisions made in the immediate aftermath of loss are not always the decisions you would make with more time and more distance. The hold had become indefinite in the way that things become indefinite when both parties are busy and when the practical pressure to decide is not urgent and when the emotional charge of the decision makes the postponing of it easier than the confronting. By 1988, 3 years after our father's death, Charles had concluded that we should sell the property. His reasoning was practical and not unreasonable. The land was not being used, the house was being maintained at a cost, and the proceeds from a sale would provide each of us with a meaningful sum that could be applied to the needs of our respective families. I did not want to sell. My reasoning was less practical, and I knew it, was rooted in something that I could not fully defend on practical grounds, which was the feeling that the land was not simply an asset, was not simply the monetary value it could be converted into, but was the physical location of everything that had made us who we were, the ground my father had walked and his father before him, the place where our mother was buried in the small churchyard a mile from the house, the place where Charles and I had been children together in the specific way that we had been children, and that no other place in the world could hold. Charles thought I was being sentimental in a way that was blocking a reasonable decision. I thought he was being practical in a way that missed the point entirely. We had talked about it several times across the preceding year with the careful management of 2 people who know they disagree about something that matters and who are trying to reach a resolution without damaging the thing between them in the reaching. And then, in the summer of 1988, on a phone call that I have replayed in some form at least 1,000 times in the 35 years since, the carefulness failed. I said something I should not have said. I want to be specific about this because the truth of what happened requires specificity, requires the acknowledgement that the thing that broke the relationship was not the disagreement about the land, but what I said in the heat of the disagreement about the land, which was a thing about Charles's motivation, about what I said was his willingness to convert our father's memory into money, said in the heat of my own frustration, in a way that implied a moral failing, implied that his practical view of the situation reflected something about his character, rather than simply a different assessment of what our father and the fiat, land and the proceeds of its sale, meant and should be used for. I said it, and I knew as I said it that it was too far, knew it in the moment of saying it, and said it anyway, because that is the thing about the heat of argument. It produces in the space between knowing and speaking a failure of the mechanism that usually stops you before you get to the words that go too far. Charles did not shout back. He was quiet for a moment, the specific quality of quiet that follows something that has landed in a place that the person who received it needs time to process before they respond. And then he said, in a voice that was level in a way that cost him something to make level, that he thought we probably needed some time before we talked again. And then he ended the call, and the time he suggested became a week, and then a month, and then several months, and then a year, and then the kind of silence that is no longer a pause, but a new condition, a reorganization of the relationship into something that does not include the contact that had previously defined it, a silence that both parties maintain, because neither knows how to break it without acknowledging the full weight of how long it has been allowed to stand. I want to tell you about the early years of the silence, because I think the early years are the period that is most important and most honest to account for, the period when the silence was still a choice, in a way that it stopped being later, when the breaking of it was still a matter of will, rather than of the accumulated thickness of years that eventually makes any action feel impossible by comparison with the inaction that has replaced it. I was angry for the first year. The anger was real, and I am not going to diminish it retroactively by saying it was not justified, because in the way that anger is justified, which is the way of being a response to something that felt like a genuine wrong, it was. Charles had, in my assessment of the situation, reduced something irreducible, had applied a financial framework to something that was not fundamentally a financial matter, and my anger at that was the anger of someone who felt that something sacred to him had been treated as ordinary, and the feeling was genuine even if the expression of it, the thing I had said on the phone, had been unjust. But the anger began to change in the second year, not to diminish exactly, but to become more complicated, to admit into its composition other things that I had not allowed enduring. The first year, when the anger was still unchallenged, and when the maintenance of it required the exclusion of anything that might qualify it, what began to enter the composition was the memory of his face, or the imagined version of his face on the other end of the phone when I said what I said, the expression of someone who has been accused of something that strikes, at a place where he understands his own goodness to reside, and the imagining of that expression produced in me something that the anger had been suppressing, which was remorse, not the clean and self-exculpating remorse that immediately converts into grievance, but the real and uncomfortable kind that sits with the knowledge of what you did and does not try to convert it into anything else. I thought about calling him. I thought about it with a regularity that increased rather than decreased across the second and third years of the silence. Thought about it at the phone and in the car, and in the evenings when the week's call would have happened, and when the silence in the place where the call had been was its own kind of presence. I composed the call in my mind dozens of times, composed the opening sentence, the acknowledgement of what I had said, and that it had been wrong, the apology that I wanted to make without conditions, without thee, that apologies sometimes carry that convert them into continued argument. I composed all of that, and I did not make the call. I am going to try to explain why I did not make the call, because the explanation is not flattering, and I think the not flattering version is the honest one. I did not make the call because making it required me to be, in the first moment of contact, after 3 years of silence, more vulnerable than I knew how to be, required me to open with the acknowledgement of what I had done wrong, without knowing what he would do with the opening, whether he would receive it or whether he would, in the accumulated hurt of 3 years of silence, meet the opening with something that I was not prepared to receive in return, something that would make the situation worse than the silence had made it. The risk of the call was not only the humility it required, but the uncertainty of what the humility would produce, and I had, by the time the 3rd year of silence had become the 4th, developed around that uncertainty a caution that functioned as avoidance, that I understood as prudence, and that was, I know now, cowardice. Gloria told me to call him. She told me this in various forms across the years, with the patience and the occasional exasperation of a woman who understood what the silence was costing me, and who could see more clearly than I could the distance between the difficulty of making the call and the cost of not making it. She was not wrong, and her not wrongness was part of what made the telling harder to receive, because receiving accurate counsel on something you are not yet willing to do requires either the willingness to act on it or the willingness to acknowledge that you are choosing not to act on it, and both of those were more than I could consistently manage. I told myself, across the years that became a decade and then 2 decades, that there would be a time, that the right moment would present itself, that some event or circumstance would create an opening that the passage of time alone had not created, that the silence would eventually produce its own resolution if I waited long enough. This was not an active belief. I want to be clear about that. It was not something I examined and concluded was true. It was something I allowed to function as a background assumption, because the background assumption was preferable to the foreground confrontation of what I was actually choosing, which was to let the years pass without acting. Our father's land was sold in 1991, 3 years into the silence, handled through lawyers in the efficient and effectless way that things are handled when the people who should be handling them together are not speaking. I received my half of the proceeds without ceremony, and I do not know what Charles felt when he received his, whether the sale produced the resolution he had argued for, or whether it arrived in the changed atmosphere of our estrangement as something different than it would have been if we had sold it together as brothers, standing on the land one last time and saying whatever needed to be said before we left it. I do not know, because I was not there, because the silence that had started over the land had outlasted the land itself, which is a fact I have sat with many times, and that still has the capacity, at 85, to produce in me a kind of retrospective bewilderment at the choices I was capable of making. Ruth, his wife, sent me a card when their youngest child was married in 1998. It was a wedding announcement, not a personal note, sent to the list of family members that such announcements are sent to, regardless of the specific state of the relationships between them, and I held it for a long time and thought about calling Charles, thought about whether a nephew's wedding was the occasion I had been waiting for, whether family was the lever that might open what the silence had closed. I did not call. I sent a gift and a card with the conventional language of family occasions, and received, in return, a thank-you note in Ruth's handwriting, and the exchange was civil and empty, and said nothing about what was between his brother and me, which was the 30 years of silence that had begun over a piece of land and had continued, because neither of us had yet found a way to interrupt it. I learned he was ill in 2018, not from him, from his oldest daughter, who was the intermediary the family had apparently designated for the task of informing people on the edges of Charles's life that the edges were closing. She called me on a weekday morning and told me that her father had been diagnosed with cancer the previous year, that the treatment had not done what was hoped, and that the prognosis was not good. She was careful and kind in the delivery, the specific kindness of someone who understands that they are delivering difficult information in a complicated situation, and who has prepared themselves to do it with as much grace as possible. She did not say anything about the estrangement. She did not invite me to visit or tell me that her father had asked for me. She gave me the information and let me do with it what I would. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time after that call ended. What I felt in the immediate period after was not describable in a single word or a single feeling. It was several things at once that were not fully compatible with each other. Grief and fear, and something that I recognized, with a clarity I found almost unbearable, as urgency. The specific urgency of someone who has been postponing something for 30 years, and who has just been told that the postponement has an end date that is closer than they thought. I called his number. Not his daughter's number, his number. The number I had not called in 30 years, and that I had kept in my address book across 3 different address books, across 3 different decades, kept without ever fully acknowledging to myself why I was keeping it, why I was carrying the number of a man I was not speaking to, why the number needed to persist in my possession, even as the years of silence accumulated around it. The phone rang 4 times and went to his answering machine, and I heard his voice that I had not heard in 30 years, and that was both completely familiar and slightly altered by the 30 years in ways that I could hear in the recorded message. The slight thickening of age in a voice I had known since before either of us could form words properly, and I listened to the message, and I did not leave one. I tried twice more in the following week. The second call went to the machine, and I did not leave a message. The third call was answered by Ruth, who recognized my voice when I said my name, and who was quiet for a moment with the quality of quiet that contained something larger than itself, and then said that Charles was not well enough to come to the phone. She was not unkind. She was careful in the way she had been careful in the wedding announcement and in all the careful exchanges of the years, maintaining a neutrality that I understood was not indifference, but the navigation of a situation that had no good map. She said she would tell him I called. I thanked her and ended the call, and sat with what had just happened, which was that I had tried to reach my brother, and had not reached him, and had received, in the not reaching, the particular helplessness of someone who has arrived too late to a conversation, and does not know if late is the same as too late. He died 11 weeks later. Ruth called me herself to tell me, which I understood as a gesture of some kind, an acknowledgement that whatever else was true about the situation, I was his brother, and the news was mine to receive directly rather than through a third party. The call was brief. She told me the time and the date, and that it had been peaceful, and I told her I was sorry, and she said she knew, and the call ended, and I was, in the moment of its ending, precisely where I had been for 31 years, carrying a question that now had no possibility of an answer. I did not go to the funeral. I want to say that plainly because it is the truth, and because the reasons I did not go are part of the story and not something I want to omit. I did not go because I did not know whether my presence was wanted by his children, who had grown up with the estrangement as the background of their family's relationship to me, who knew me as the uncle who did not visit and who did not call, and whose absence at family events had presumably been explained to them in some form across the years, though I do not know in what form, do not know what Charles told them about me and about what had happened between us, do not know whether I was a figure of resentment in his telling of it, or a figure of simple absence, or whether he told them anything at all. I did not know these things, and the not knowing made the attendance at his funeral feel like an imposition I had not been invited to make. And so I stayed home and sat in the particular silence of that Thursday morning and thought about my brother in the way I had been thinking about him, privately and without resolution, for 31 years. What I want to tell you about the years since his death, and it has been nearly 5 years now, is that the question does not get easier with time. I had a hope, in the first months after he died, that time would do something useful with the unanswerable quality of the question, would soften it into something more bearable, if not more resolvable. And that hope has been partially met in the sense that the grief is different now than it was in those first months, and that I carry the question with more ease than I once did. But the question itself has not changed. Whether he forgave me is not something I know, and it is not something I can find out. And the living with that fact has been, and continues to be, the primary moral and emotional work of my old age. I have spent considerable time thinking about what forgiveness would have meant had I been able to receive it. Not only the emotional relief of it, though that would have been real and significant, but what it would have changed about the 31 years that preceded it. And what I have come to understand, thinking about this, is that the forgiveness would not have given me back those years, would not have resolved the estrangement retroactively, or returned to us the decades of phone calls and family gatherings and the ordinary continuity of a close relationship that we did not have. The forgiveness would have closed the account. It would have been the acknowledgement between the two of us that what happened was not the final word on who we were to each other, that the thing I said and the silence that followed were not the definition of the relationship, but a departure from it, and that the departure, however long, was not permanent in the way that death is permanent. The death made it permanent. That is the fact I live with. The departure is now permanent, not because the estrangement could not have been repaired, but because the opportunity to repair it was not taken by me, was not taken by him, either so far as I know, and the death closed the account in the state it was in, with the departure unreconciled, and the question of forgiveness unasked and unanswered, and now unanswerable. My daughter Catherine asked me, about a year after Charles died, whether I had been able to forgive myself. She asked it with the directness and the tenderness that she has always brought to the hardest questions, and I told her I was working on it, which was true and which remains true, and which is, I think, the most accurate answer I can give, that the work is ongoing, and that ongoing is not the same as unresolved, that I am somewhere in the middle of something that does not have a clean endpoint, and that I am trying to be at peace with the middle. What the working on it has produced, across the years of it, is not the resolution of the question, but something alongside the question that I did not have in the early years of my grief, which is a more complete understanding of my brother, and of what I lost in the 31 years of not knowing him as an adult, of not being present for the things that happened in his life across those years, of not being the kind of brother to his children that I could have been and was not. The completeness of the loss is something that the estrangement obscured while it was ongoing, because the estrangement had a quality of suspension about it, the quality of a thing that is paused rather than ended, that always contained the theoretical possibility of resumption, and the death removed the theoretical possibility and left only the actual loss, which was larger than I had let myself understand, while the theoretical possibility of resumption still existed. I think about him differently now than I thought about him during the silence. During the silence, I thought about him primarily in the frame of the argument and what had followed from it, thought about him in relation to the estrangement, the person I had wronged and from whom I needed forgiveness, and that frame, while not inaccurate, was a reduction of him, a compression of a full and complex person into the role he was playing in my unresolved situation. In the years since his death, freed from the urgency of the unresolved situation by the resolution that death imposes regardless of what was or was not settled, I have begun to think about him as the person he was, rather than the person in relation to my need, and the thinking has produced, slowly and without drama, a fuller picture. He was a good man. I knew that, had always known it in the background of everything, but the knowing had been somewhat inaccessible during the years when the argument was the organizing frame for my thinking about him. He was a good husband to Ruth, and a good father to his children. I know this from the edges of what I observed across the estrangement, from the wedding announcements and the grandchildren born, and the occasional family-wide communications that reached me despite the silence. He built things. Not only houses and structures, though he built those for 30 years and built them well, but things of the less visible kind. The community of people around him who showed up at his funeral in numbers that I heard about from Catherine, who had attended in my place with the careful and generous intention of giving me some account of what it had been. I want to say something about what I wish I had done, and I want to say it specifically rather than generally, because the generally is available from anywhere, and the specifically is only available from someone who has lived this particular version of the story. I wish I had called him in 1989, not because I am certain the call would have succeeded, not because I know he would have received the apology in the way I hoped he would, but because 1989 was the year when the silence was still young, enough to be interrupted without requiring the interruption to carry the weight of all the years that accumulated after it. The longer a silence goes on, the heavier the interruption of it becomes, not because the underlying wound is any larger, but because the interruption has to address not only the original wound, but all the time that the wound was allowed to stand unaddressed, and the accumulated time becomes its own thing, its own form of injury. And the call in 1989 would have had to address only the one thing rather than the two. I wish I had called him when I heard about his illness and left a message that said something real. Not the measured opening sentence I had been composing in my mind for 30 years. Not the careful and qualified apology that protected me from the vulnerability of a fully open statement, but something simple and direct and true. Something that said, I was sorry for what I had said, and I was sorry for the 30 years, and that I loved him, which was true and had always been true, in which the 30 years had not changed in any direction. The message might have gone unanswered. He might have been too ill or too resolved in his own position to respond to it. But the sending of it would have closed, from my end, what the silence had left open, and the closing from my end would have been something, even in the absence of a response, even without knowing what it produced in him when he heard it. I did not do those things. I am not able to do them now. What I am able to do, and what I have decided to do with the remaining years I have, is to tell this story with the honesty it deserves, to not let the shame of it convert it into something smaller or more manageable than it actually was, to carry the unanswerable question without pretending it is answered, and without letting the carrying of it prevent me from being present to the people in my life who are still here and with whom the accounts are still open. I have a brother-in-law, Gloria's younger brother, with whom I have had, across the years, a warm but somewhat shallow relationship, the relationship of people who are connected through someone they both love and who have not invested significantly in each other beyond that connection. I called him last spring, on a Saturday morning, with no particular occasion and no particular purpose other than to talk to him, to be in contact with him in a way that was not mediated by the occasion it was necessary for. We talked for an hour and a half about his grandchildren and his garden and a book he had been reading and things I had been thinking about. And at the end of the call he said, "This was good." And I said, "I know." And what I meant, and what I think he understood I meant, was that the call itself, the unremarkable Saturday morning phone call between two men in their 80s who had not made enough of these calls across the years, was something worth making, was something that could not be assumed to be available indefinitely, and that the availability of it on this particular Saturday morning was not nothing. My brother is gone. The question of his forgiveness is gone with him. I carry both of those facts, and I will carry them for whatever years remain to me. And the carrying is not light, and is not finished. And it is also, I have come to understand, not the only thing I am carrying, not the only weight in the account of who I have been, and what I have done, and what I still have available to do. If you are estranged from someone, if there is a silence in your life that began over something that seemed worth the silence at the time, and that has been running long enough to have become its own condition, rather than a response to the original condition. If there is a person you have not called because the not calling is accumulated past the point where the calling feels simple, and before the point where it feels impossible, I am asking you to call, not because I can promise you what you will receive on the other end of the call, because I cannot, not because I can assure you the silence will resolve cleanly into the relationship it interrupted, because it may not, but because the call is the one action available to you that the death will make unavailable, and the death will come, and on the morning of the death, the question of whether you might have called will join the other questions that have no answers, and you will carry it the way I have carried mine, as the weight of a thing that could have been done and was not, in the time that existed for the doing and that no longer exists. My brother's name was Charles. He built houses for 30 years, and he loved his family, and he died not knowing whether his brother was sorry. And whether he forgave me, I will never know. And I am telling you this not to have your sympathy, though I receive it if you offer it, but so that you will not have a version of the same story to tell when your time comes to tell it. Call the person. Call them today, if today is the day you are hearing this. Not because it will be easy, because it may not be, because the alternative is a question you will carry for the rest of your life. And I can tell you from 85 years and 5 years of living inside that question, that the carrying is heavier than the call would have been, and that the question, once it has no answer, does not get lighter with time. It gets more honest, that is all. It gets more honest, and the honesty, without the answer, is what you have left.